Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about how the British media claims that China looks down on Europe, seeing it as abandoned by the United States. The involved EU is said to have two faces, soft-spoken towards China but tough in policy, because they think the Chinese are fools. Europe sees China as a competitor, but China has long considered Europe to be past its prime. The Economist's China column, Tea House, published an article on November 17th calling attention to how Europe is looked down upon by China. The article says that while European leaders are outspoken when it comes to their own political and economic problems, unfortunately, they are not as adept at solving them. However, if they are particularly inclined towards self-torment, they can take a trip to China, where they will hear plenty of self-criticism coming from Europeans themselves. These criticisms are amplified and replayed with an even sharper tone. Europeans are still debating how to avoid falling into the predicament between China and the US. But in the eyes of many Chinese people, this is completely unnecessary because they already see Europe as a pawn of the United States. While Europeans are still anxiously worrying about their competitiveness, many Chinese find this anxiety quite amusing. The Economist article even quotes a Chinese scholar's opinion. He said that Europe has no way to truly break away from the United States and achieve independence. Chinese media have even bluntly stated that Europe simply lacks the capability to meet challenges in many technological fields. As for the issue of European unity, Chinese scholars' views are even more straightforward than those of EU bureaucrats. Let's not even talk about unification. Whether the EU can even hold out for 3 to 5 years is already a question, but these are just public statements. According to a recent Economist column, after speaking with several Chinese scholars, it turns out that their private views are often even sharper. One Chinese advisor said that Europe is a bit like an aging, dependent noble who is unwilling to accept the reality of being abandoned by the American emperor. Another person said that Europe is overly protective of innovation, and a European business representative even claimed that during a recent visit to China, he was rebuked. He even suspects that the Chinese side said this just to mock him. The Economist, eager to defend the EU, tried to explain that the Chinese perspective is somewhat biased, but at the same time admitted that the analysis of Europe as weak and divided is not entirely wrong. On the other hand, there are accusations that China has blind spots in its policy toward Europe. For example, China believes that Europe basically just follows the United States and is caught in a lot of conflicts. Regarding the Nexperia semiconductor incident, Chinese observers have never believed that the Dutch government's forced takeover of Nexperia was solely for its own economic security. From the Chinese perspective, for a small country to dare to act so decisively, it must be doing so on behalf of the United States. The Economist's author also mentioned that China hopes to portray a win-win future with Europe. However, this overlooks Europe's concerns about China's economic model. When China retaliated, its actions were aimed at the Trump administration, but European companies were also affected, and the atmosphere in China-Europe research circles has become increasingly tense. After German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock stirred up concerns in Japan about China's growing assertiveness, she ended up cancelling her visit to China because the Chinese side did not arrange high-level meetings for her. This European representative admitted that they are already very tired of China's lecturing toward Europe and feel they can completely ignore the Economist's article. Moreover, China indeed seems unconcerned about the deterioration of China-Europe relations. Chinese officials have consulted and believe they have already gained the upper hand in the trade war with Trump, and that dealing with Europe will be even easier. Besides, China's relationships with Spain and Ali are both developing very well. In the end, the author of The Economist still tries to act tough, claiming that if China does not adjust its approach on the issue of trade with Russia, Europe may take a tougher stance. If China continues to think that Europe will simply follow the United States, it will overlook a crucial point. Europe's new sense of anger stems from its own considerations. This article from The Economist is filled with resentment towards China, stemming from the EU's own predicament, which actually proves that the author has misjudged the EU's true interests. In reality, the EU no longer needs to blindly believe in so-called shared values with the United States or follow the US in its anti-China stance, thinking that cooperating with China would increase its own risks. By doing so, it completely ignores the fact that Trump makes decisions based on America first. Trump can call on the EU to oppose China on one hand, while reaching agreements with China on the other. In any case, The Economist mentioned that the Chinese see Europe as somewhat like an aging, retired entity, and this is indeed a fact. The EU is full of a sense of involvement in other people's affairs. You just have to look at the behavior of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to see it. According to a South China Morning Post report on November 17, Several sources have revealed that, in order to safeguard key industries and chip supplies, the EU has already instructed its officials to use more moderate language when dealing with China, aiming to ease tensions. The report, citing sources, noted this when reviewing the recent state of China-EU relations. After China announced its rare earth export control policy in April, European industries were impacted. Ammon then engaged in several months of negotiations with China, reaching an agreement on rare earth export permits, hoping to persuade China to issue more licenses. However, on September 30th, the Dutch government suddenly ordered the forcible takeover of Nexperia, a wholly owned subsidiary of China's leading semiconductor company Wingtech Technology, citing so-called national security reasons. This move further intensified tensions between China and the EU. According to sources, in order to ensure the supply of rare earths and Nexperia's chips, the EU has shifted to a de-escalation mode, instructing its diplomats to use more moderate language when dealing with Chinese officials and to avoid making publicly provocative statements about China, so as to prevent such remarks from interfering with ongoing negotiations between the EU and China, said an EU diplomatic source. So, is European industry once again in a precarious situation? The EU shouldn't be engaging in so-called confrontational diplomacy right now, but the EU's softer tone towards China doesn't actually mean it wants to improve relations. Instead, it's a strategy of being soft in words but tough in actions. At the same time, the EU is planning to implement even tougher policies towards China, seeking to reduce its dependence on China and promote the so-called de-risking process. According to sources, the EU wants to use this dual strategy to put pressure on China while also avoiding an escalation of conflict. However, the South China Morning Post believes that these actions could make the already strained China-EU relationship even more complicated. Last week, during the China-EU forum held in Brussels, Belgium, EU officials focused on discussing topics such as climate cooperation, making every effort to avoid issues where there are differences between the two sides. In addition, when China and the EU talked about trade relations, Beate Bierwert, an aide to Maroš Šefčovič, the European Commission's Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security, made a cautious comment. Bierwert said that even though the occasion called for more diplomatic language, she did not want to avoid the issues, and that the current situation is indeed worrying for China-EU relations. The main trend is more downward than upward. We hope to work together to reverse this situation, and more importantly, we must maintain contact and engage in dialogue, because if both sides stop communicating, we could end up in an even worse situation. However, while diplomats use more diplomatic language, the EU is actually pushing for a tougher policy towards China, aiming to reduce its dependence on China. Last week, the EU called for the prompt removal of the tax exemption policy for imported small parcels valued at less than €150. The plan is set to take effect at the beginning of 2026, and this move restricts the development of Chinese e-commerce platforms in Europe. The European Commission has been exerting pressure on EU member states, pushing them to exclude Chinese tech companies like Huawei from 5G and future 6G networks. On November 13th, German Chancellor Scholz stated that Germany would exclude Chinese companies from its telecommunications network construction, and that the government is now consulting with the French government on this issue. In addition, the EU plans to introduce a series of new bills by the end of this year to promote the so-called de-risking process. In December, the EU will propose the Industrial Accelerator Act, which will require Chinese companies investing in industries such as electric vehicles in Europe to transfer technology to European companies. The European Commission is also drafting new plans to seek to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earths. According to sources, this year's G20 summit is about to be held in South Africa. The EU intends to apply a dual strategy of timing more moderate policies with tougher ones to put pressure on China, while at the same time avoiding escalation of issues such as rare earths and Nexperia semiconductors. As for China-EU relations, China's stance is actually simple and clear. Some people in the diplomatic sector have already stated that certain individuals on the European side are stuck in a Cold War mentality, misled by false information, deliberately exaggerating China-EU differences, and lacking a correct understanding of China and China-EU relations. This not only affects China-EU cooperation, but is also detrimental to the EU itself. It is hoped that the European side can truly establish an objective and rational understanding of China, adopt a more proactive and pragmatic China policy, and ensure the healthy and stable development of China-EU relations. To sum it up, firstly, Europe is like an aging person in need of care, unwilling to accept the reality of being abandoned by the American empire. Europe has no way to truly break free from the United States and achieve independence. Secondly, China neither will nor needs to wait for the EU. China has already reached a trade agreement with the EU's boss, Trump, so why should it still care about the EU's attitude? Thirdly, the EU clings to its inferiority complex, still wanting to closely follow the US, trying to play a double game by talking tough in words and soft in policy. Does EU President Ursula von der Leyen really think the Chinese are fools who can't see through these little tricks? Does she think China won't respond firmly?